Next, Holly. You're on mute, Holly.
Sorry, thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for coming before the committee today. It's been really informative and also really infuriating, I think, to hear from the different witnesses. I'm obviously particularly taken by Simon and Fiona's statement being a Cork TD, and I can really attest to that. There's nothing that my office gets contacted more about than the absolute absence of any support services in the area. And you were talking about the absence of the kindergarten services in Cork City, in all of Cork Southwest, in the south of the city. There isn't one special school, and this is just a constant issue, and a thing we've constantly heard about in this committee. And then, of course, you mentioned that you're fortunate enough to be able to pay it, and we speak to very many families who actually just can't, and their children are not getting the services that they need, and that early intervention is obviously so important. And I think, we're talking about like how do we do this, and we're asking questions, kind of scratching our head, how do we go about this? And I think we need to kind of call a spade as well, and Simon Fiona, you mentioned that the Progressing Disability Services is a failure, and I've said that straight out to the HSC at one of these meetings, I think it was last week. People just absolutely aren't getting the service they need, and if we want to look at how do we go about addressing this issue, I think there's a very obvious first step, and that is funding it. So the department's own capacity review said we need 350 million to meet the unmet needs of people with disabilities in this country. And there was an additional 65 million in the budget. So there is no actual intention. And hearing Peter speak about how a year after the UNCRPD came in, that Australia ratified it, it took Ireland 10 years, which is disgraceful. And we still haven't actually ratified the optional protocol, which makes the state obliged to allow people to exercise their own rights. And I think we have to just be a bit more upfront about the reality of the situation here. It does come down to political will, and that needs to change. And you're talking about creating awareness and that in Australia and the public wanting it. Absolutely, the public in Ireland want that. And you can see that by virtue of the fact that most of where the state abdicates responsibility, you see the general public oftentimes swooping in, and fundraisers and all of these not-for-profit organisations trying to support families and individuals. So we certainly have the public will, we just need the political will and the funding, and we are a country that can afford it. And to hear the comparisons of Cork and Galway, I think is quite stark, and then even more stark is Australia versus Ireland. And I have to say, from working abroad in disability support services, and it's not just Australia, I was working in Malta, and the services I was working with had access, daily to speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, equine therapy, hydrotherapy, art therapy, the list goes on, and really encouraging people to live independently. And here you can't even get, an hour of speech and language therapy. Sorry for going on about the questions I have. Because of the ones that the previous speakers have addressed, I'm going to direct my questions mainly at the National Advocacy Service, if that's okay. I hear so many positive reports about the service that you provide, and I just think it'd be really useful for us as a committee if we could learn a little bit more about that service. So I'm wondering if you give us a sense of your work. And one of the clearest and most worrying points raised before the committee has been that individuals and families have to fight for basic health, education, transport and care services again and again. As well as being simply wrong that people have to do that, it sort of implies that people have the capacity and means to struggle for services. I think it would be really useful for us, the committee, to understand the vital service that you provide and the type of issues you help individuals with, and how long it can take to kind of solve those cases. And in your opening statement, you also mentioned the reality that we'll have more people living with disabilities in the future. So I'm wondering, how will your service be able to cater for the accompanying increased demand? And how many advocates do we have nationally? And is there an estimation of how many more we'll need to reach international best practice? You also highlight the eradicating the practice of next of kin consent, which is no legal basis except in certain circumstances. Yet NAS advocates encounter it in different settings. I just wonder if you could elaborate for the committee as well to have a better understanding. And finally, you specifically discussed the disgraceful situation of over 1,300 people under 65 forced to live in nursing homes. by a state that just isn't providing independent supported living. And I know situations in my own constituency where people are forced to actually be in the psychiatric ward because there's no opportunity for any kind of independent supported living. I'm wondering if you can give a sense of the issues advocates have encountered and the rights they've helped individuals fight for. Thank you.
The advocacy, Joanne, Louise.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Deputy, for your questions. I might start off and bring Joanne in as we go. So just to tell you a little bit more about our service, so the National Advocacy Service is funded by the Citizens Information Board, which in of itself is funded by the Department of Social Protection. We have a particular remit to support people who are isolated in their communities, living in residential services and communicate differently. Our service is only for adults, so we don't provide support to children, although we do see when people age out of our education services and come into adult services, and I suppose that's where the issues that Simon and Fiona have so eloquently highlighted, that we see the future and the impact of those situations. I think that to your point around the types of issues that come up for us, it's very wide ranging. It can be housing is a huge one, and when we're describing housing, we mean the broadest range in terms of accommodation. So we're talking about people who might be living in residential services, an old style institutional setting that actually no longer want to be there. And it can take a very long time to support people to transition out of that into independent living. It can also mean people who, say particularly on the autism spectrum, who actually can find themselves and on the cusp of homelessness or actually homeless, and particularly in Dublin that can be an issue. We also, one of our main areas of work is really around supporting people to build their own capacity around decision making and be involved in decisions. And I think Joanne highlighted that in one of her earlier remarks about the fact that many disabled people, because of the disempowerment they experience from quite a young age, in terms of not being supported to live their lives to their full capacity, actually when they're given the opportunity to make decisions or exercise choice, it's extremely challenging for them, and they do require a lot of support to get to that point. So a lot of our work is around building people's confidence and autonomy to actually even voice their concerns about decisions that are actually being made for them, about them, in quite fundamental basic rights about where you live and how you spend your time. The other areas, I suppose, where we would also be involved would be around access to justice, and some of the issues around next of kin and ward of court are a particular theme of our work. We haven't done a projection per se in terms of what's come out of the capacity review in terms of the longer term growth in the numbers of disabled people. What I would say is that we currently have approximately 28 advocates around the country and 8 senior advocates, and then a very small management and support team around that. We do have waiting lists, and they've been growing, and we would be seeking an increase in resources to support us to fully deliver those services, because it takes us a long time to actually support people to achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve. And we also anticipate that when the Assisted Decision Making Act is commenced next year, that there will be an increased demand for advocacy there, as well as people seek to implement the provisions of the Act in terms of their own decision making. I might pass over to Joanne just to talk about maybe the next of kin, and then maybe just some of the casework and how long it can take. I think maybe the complexity of it. Some of the issues that Simon and Fiona have highlighted that we see on the adult side, and how complex that can be, and why advocacy is so critical. So I might pass over to Joanne for those parts of your questions. Thanks, Deputy.
Thank you very much, Joanne.
So thank you for your question, Deputy Cairns. As Louise has mentioned, the work of advocates can really span across all of those areas that Louise mentioned in terms of the issues. You asked a question in terms of the length of our casework, and I guess really it depends on the complexity and the number of issues. For many of those we work with, it isn't just one or two single issues that they're facing, it can be multiple issues. So you can have somebody living in an institution for many, many years who has poor quality of life, limited natural supports, limited access to appropriate therapeutic supports, limited access to their community, and then that can be further compounded by the likes of consent, next of kin issues. So, for example, we would do an awful lot of work around issues like do not attempt resuscitation orders, where individuals' own wishes are not being sought about their wishes, should they be facing end of life or facing emergency decision making. Their decisions around treatment choices, should they be accessing healthcare services, are often ignored to the detriment of seeking families' wishes as to how they would wish for their loved one to be cared for. And obviously for an adult with a disability, in the context of discussions around UNCRPD and rights, and people living ordinary lives, self-determined lives, it's essential that people's voices are heard. People have the opportunity to make those decisions for themselves. So we do a huge amount of work in upholding rights, in pointing to the HSE's consent policy, which very often is not understood or implemented across many divisions of healthcare services. There is a prevalence of next of kin forms that exist within our healthcare services that seek the consent of third parties, which has absolutely no legitimate basis without proper legal authority to do so. So that's a huge area of our work. We would also have seen throughout the COVID-19 pandemic much next of kin decision making with regard to COVID vaccines, and again people's own wishes around whether they chose to receive or refuse vaccinations ignored, and family members asked. So at a very basic level, rights are not being respected in day-to-day decision making. Never mind the fight that we've already heard so well described in the previous speakers with regard to access to services. We would also work, I suppose, with those who are maybe most marginalised, those who are wards of court, those whose voices often don't get heard in decision-making forums, and we work to represent those voices to be heard so that people can have a say in what happens to them and where they live and the decisions that others are taking. And we obviously very much welcome the abolishment of that system as we move towards full implementation of the Assisted Decision-Making Act. With regard to, I suppose, other areas of employment, of parenting with a disability, we would also provide quite complex support to those who are navigating the social care system, where their children may be taken into care, they're attending court, there are care proceedings, and supporting people's access to justice, ensuring equal opportunity, ensuring fair process, ensuring that people understand and support. And there is a really big area of improvement that can be made across accessibility and access to services. There is a distinct issue in how Ireland currently defines disability with regard to HSE service provision, and we do need to move more towards the definition of disability with regard to how people access services. So it's really encouraging to hear how Mr. Broadhead explained that in the Australian system, the definition of advocacy that applies in terms of accessing services is that broader piece, and it isn't based on assessment to the point of what we see here in terms of HSE services, and that distinction between mild, moderate disability and that defining whether or not you can access services. So there are so many obstacles that people face on a day-to-day basis to access their basic rights, basic services, to have their voices heard, to live quality lives. We have to come back to the fact that it's not just about receiving a service, it's about having a good life. And I suppose everything that the Advocacy Service does right across all of those issues that we have just described is about supporting people to live lives of their choosing where it matters, having access to home supports, having access to PA supports, having access to community services, also that they can build capacity and have the opportunities that everybody else has. There is a big gap there still. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.